Thank you so much for tuning in with us here at Seven City Church. Our prayer is that this message would help you know Christ, encourage you to experience community, and help you influence culture like never before. We hope you enjoy today's message.
In the book of Psalms, we find a very well-known psalm that King David, king of Israel, penned. And in these 6 verses, although they are some of the most common verses you've probably heard in whatever context or situation it might be, sometimes the meaning escapes us. We don't understand fully the depth of what David was describing. And so a couple of weeks ago, we dived into Psalm 23, and it begins with that phrase that we have heard so often, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." And whenever it comes to the New Testament, we find this emphasis on the shepherd and his sheep throughout both the Old and the New Testaments. In the New Testament, Jesus makes a statement in John 10, verse 14. He said, "I am the good shepherd." So Jesus is the good shepherd, and as we learned in our first message in this series, the good shepherd provides us with 4 things. He provides us with rest, he provides us with spiritual refreshing, he renews us with strength, and he leads us in paths of righteousness. And then last week, we learned that God walks with us when we go through the dark seasons of life. How many have been through a dark season or 2 in your life? Some of you are like, yeah, I'm in one right now. He walks with us in those dark seasons, and not only does he walk with us, but we learned last week that he also has 2 tools that he carries with us through the dark valley. He has a rod and he has a staff. And we learned that the rod was symbolic of God's word, that it protects us and that it also corrects us at times. And then also he carries the staff. The staff was symbolic of God's Spirit. And God's Spirit connects us, draws us to Jesus, as well as directs our paths. Well, today as we continue our series, we're looking at the next verse, verse 5 in Psalm 23, where we discover another powerful expression of how the Lord is our shepherd. This is what he says: "You prepare a table before me." This is David writing, and he's saying of the Lord his shepherd, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Now, whenever he said table, what exactly did David mean in that moment? Well, you have to understand first the journey the shepherd was taking with the sheep. You see, when the psalm begins, David says that our shepherd leads us to green pastures, and then he takes us to quiet waters, and then he guides us along the dark valley, paths that go through the dark valley, but the green pastures and the quiet waters and the paths that he leads us down and the dark valley that we go through, they all lead us to a place, and the place that they lead us to is a table. You see, a table to a shepherd, it was a reference to a table land. The table land, it was like this high range, this high point that shepherds would lead their sheep up to graze in. It was kind of like this cherished place where shepherds would take their sheep to and where they would graze and they would enjoy the vegetation and the grass. And so the shepherd would take them to this high range, to this table land. And here's what's interesting about this table land. In the western United States, this high plateau that the sheep would range on was often referred to as mesas, which is a Spanish word for tables. And so the shepherd would lead his sheep from the green pastures through the dark valleys up to the table land, and he always got to the table land during the summertime. Why? Because the snow had melted by then. The ice was gone by then. He would bring them up to the tablelands during the summertime for them to enjoy. And what is interesting is what the shepherd did before the sheep got to the tableland. The shepherd would prepare a table. David said, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." How would the shepherd prepare the tableland? You see, the shepherd would often go ahead of the sheep to the tableland to prepare the land for the sheep's arrival. So, for example, he would go to the tableland and he would scope it out and make sure he knew what's the best place for the sheep to graze. He would look at the grass and the vegetation and see where the best supply of food was going to be. Not only that, he would scope it out and see where's going to be the best place for my sheep to lie down, to rest here in the tableland. Not only that, he would remove any poisonous weeds that he found so that he was protecting the sheep from potential death. He would also begin to remove from the water holes and from the springs twigs and leaves and branches to make sure they were clear so that the sheep could drink. What was the shepherd doing? He was preparing the table. He was preparing the tableland for the sheep's arrival. And then notice what David says next. He says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Because you see, you had this high range where the sheep were grazing, but around it you would have this rim rock, and in the rim rock, that's where the predators would often hide. The cougars and the lions and the bears and these different animals that would pick off the sheep if they had a chance. So they could see the sheep from the rim rock. They would look down onto the tableland. They could see the sheep, and if they had a chance to pick one off, that's exactly what they would do. So the shepherd would go ahead to the tableland in advance to prepare the table for the arrival of the sheep so that the predators couldn't pick them off one by one. So David is writing this passage, and he's saying, quite literally, the Lord our God, our good shepherd, prepares for each one of us a table in the presence of our enemies. And can I remind you today that you do have an enemy? It is a spiritual enemy, and his name is Satan. He is real. In fact, the Apostle Peter said this in 1 Peter chapter 5. He said, be alert and of sober mind, your enemy, the devil. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Satan is not simply a figment of your imagination. Satan is not simply a symbol of evil or a symbol of the very worst thing that you can imagine. No, Satan is a very real, evil, demonic presence, and listen to me, and he hates you. He is bent on one thing, and that is your and my destruction. In fact, Jesus described him like this. Jesus said this in the Gospel of John. He said, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. That's what he does. The thief he's talking about is Satan. He comes to kill, steal, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So Jesus is all about life. He's all about an abundant life he desires for his people to have. But Satan is bent on our destruction completely and fully. And if you think he is a figment of everyone's imagination, he has already won the battle because he's convinced you he does not exist. So that he can carry out his demonic work and you can blame it on everyone but him. Now here's the good news. You may have an enemy. But you've also got a good shepherd that prepares a table for you right in front of your enemy. Right in the very presence of your enemy. So here's the good news. David declares that the Lord, our good shepherd, he prepares a table for us in the presence of our enemy. So here's what that means. The good news is this, that in the middle of your pain and in the middle of your hardship, in the middle of your sin and the middle of your suffering, in the middle of your medical diagnosis or your financial setback or your relational distress or your failed semester at school or whatever enemy you feel like you're fighting today, can I tell you that you have a good shepherd that even in the middle of that situation is preparing a table for you, and what's on the table is his blessing and his goodness and his abundance. That's the good shepherd that you and I serve. He is faithful and he is good and he takes care of his sheep. And here's the thing you've got to understand, that this good shepherd is constantly preparing the table for your arrival. Now, this idea of a table, this was like the Jews understood David's language. Because you see, the Jews understood when they heard table, they knew exactly what this was about. This is where their mind went. where their mind went was to the tabernacle. You see, in the Old Testament, God gives instructions for a tabernacle to be built. And the tabernacle was where man was made right with God. It's where sin was dealt with, where forgiveness was made possible. And inside of the tabernacle, there was a table. And the table was known as this table that was symbolic of God's presence. On the table was the bread of the presence. In other words, this table represented fellowship with God, intimacy with God, relationship with God. It represented the presence of God. So please hear this. When God prepares a table for us, the best part of the table is not what's on it, but who's at it. It's not what's on the table. It's not the blessing. It's not the goodness. It's not all the provision. It's not the new car, the nice house, the cool pair of shoes, whatever. It's not the blessing on the table. Instead, it is who is at the table. And who is at the table? The Good Shepherd. The Lord your God is sitting at the table, and he's invited you to sit with him. That's the good news of the table that the Lord prepares for us. And do you know who is not invited to the table? Your enemy, the devil. Satan is not invited to the table. Now, here's the thing. He sees the table. What did David say? The Lord prepares a table in the presence of my enemies. So Satan, the enemy of your soul, the enemy that hates everything about you, he may be in the rimrock and he may be able to look down and see the table, but he ain't invited. You're invited to the table. The Lord sits at the table and he says, come join me. Come feast on the blessing at the table. But the greatest blessing at the table isn't what's on it, but rather who's at it. And you're invited to sit at it because the Lord sits there and invites you to join him. Now, let me make a connection here that I think is really powerful about the significance of the table. Because again, God prepares this table, this place of blessing and abundance and flourishing. And he does so even though our spiritual enemy is constantly wanting to attack. He prowls around like a lion. The table is set in his presence and it's filled with abundance. And oftentimes we go looking for abundance everywhere else but the Lord's table. It's filled with abundance, but again, the greatest abundance is not what's on it, but who's at it. And I think a beautiful connection here, a beautiful component to the significance of the table for us today is to understand really what that means for us as followers of Jesus and the significance. And to help us understand that, I want to share a couple of stories with you. In his book, The Burden is Light, Pastor John Tyson shares two powerful stories about the United States journey into space, like outer space. On August 20th and on September the 5th, 1977, two spacecraft named Voyager were launched into deep space. Each craft carried a golden phonograph record. You got to remember this, back in the 70s. A golden phonograph record constructed by Carl Sagan and his team of experts. Sagan and his team had been commissioned to determine the contents of that golden phonograph record. And the contents had to capture the essence of humanity. The contents had to capture the significance of the human experience. In other words, the phonograph, the record was all about what it meant to be human. And so on that record, they put 115 photographs. They put a photograph of a woman at the supermarket. They put a photograph of a father with his daughter. They put a photograph of a gymnast. They put a photograph of all of these pictures of geography and nature science. In addition, on this record, they had 90 minutes of recording. They had a baby crying that was being soothed by its mother's words. They had music on the record, everything from Bach to Johnny B. Good. They had these sounds. They had 60 different human languages on the record. They had greetings from the President of the United States and from the Secretary General of the United Nations. All of these things were on this record that were going to be sent into space. Again, creating this phonograph record of human history would be quite the task, and so Sagan and his team chose to focus on humanity. 8 years earlier, another spacecraft was launched known as the Apollo 11. This one didn't carry a golden record. Instead it carried the first human beings that would land on the moon and walk on the surface of the moon. It had an entirely different mission. And once the spacecraft had landed on the surface of the moon, and yet before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the surface of the moon, something remarkable happened. They peered out the window and they could see Earth. And they were struck and in awe. It's one thing when you're here looking up there, but it's another when you're there and you're looking back here. And as they looked at Earth, suddenly they were struck by just the enormity of all that has transpired in human history was captured in this place. All of the suffering, all of the joy, the good times, the bad times, the hard times, the fun times. It's like it all just came together as they looked out that window and stared and watched Earth suspended in space. This place that they looked at from so far away, suddenly they recognized all of the drama of human history happened there. All of the pain and suffering of human history happened there. From Hitler to Mozart, from Copernicus to Mother Teresa, it all happened in this space. Before they walked on the surface of the moon, Buzz Aldrin decided he wanted to do something significant and meaningful, and he wanted to commemorate this moment because this was a milestone moment in history, and it was a milestone moment in innovation. And so he had wrestled before they ever left Earth. What will I do in that moment? What do I want to do in that moment to commemorate, to remember, to celebrate this time in human history? And so he made up his mind before he ever left. And later on, he wrote these words indicating exactly what happened before he and Neil Armstrong stepped out of the aircraft and walked on the surface of the moon. This is what Aldrin wrote. He said, "In an effort to remain calm and collected, I decided that this would be an excellent time for a ceremony I had planned as an expression of gratitude and hope. I settled on a well-known expression of spirituality, celebrating the first Christian communion on the moon. I wanted to do something positive for the world, so the spiritual aspect appealed greatly to me. So during those first hours on the moon, before the planned eating and resting periods, I reached into my personal preference kit and pulled out the communion elements with a 3x5 card on which I had written the words of Jesus. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, for you can do nothing without me. I poured a thimbleful of wine from a sealed plastic container into a small chalice and waited for the wine to settle down as it swirled in the 1/6 Earth gravity of the moon. My comments to the world were inclusive. I would like to request a few moments of silence and to invite each person listening in, wherever and whomever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours and to give thanks in his or her own way. I silently read the Bible passage as I partook of the wafer and the wine and offered a private prayer for the task at hand and the opportunity I had been given. I want you to notice the difference between Sagan and Aldred. For Carl Sagan, he collected snippets of human history, and life was completely centered on us. But Buzz Aldrin chose a different path, and instead he chose a path that declared, no, life is focused on God. And in that moment chose to celebrate the greatest life that had ever walked the planet, and that was the life of Jesus, our Savior, the one who intervened in the human story and made life possible for all. And so on the surface of the moon, Aldred chose to come to the Lord's table and to celebrate communion and its significance in our lives. And so this morning, as we prepare to close out our service, I want you to know the Lord has prepared a table for you, and it was made possible through his death and his resurrection. And today he invites us to the table, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to come to the Lord's table and receive communion today and remember and celebrate what Christ has done. Because again, the Good Shepherd prepared the table, and he's sitting at it. And today he extends an invitation to each one of us. If you're watching online, he extends an invitation to you to join him at the table and to celebrate what he has done. Would you bow your heads?
Hey, thanks again for being a part of what God's doing here at Seven City Church. We hope you are blessed by today's message. If you'd like to partner with us or get more information, you can go to our website, sevencitychurch.com. Be blessed. Take care.